Bronx, one of the roughest neighborhoods in New York City. His apartment was on the second floor of an old brick building. The kind with cracked walls covered in graffiti and windows taped over with plastic sheets. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the yellowed walls smelled of mildew and cigarette smoke. Outside, the constant hum of traffic mixed with the occasional scream or gunshot echoing from a nearby alley. Jack wasn't exactly a sociable man. He worked at a small repair shop at the corner of the street, fixing old fans, radios, and whatever broken appliances people brought in. The shop barely made enough money to cover his bills. But Jack had learned to live with less. He didn't talk much to his neighbors, who were mostly struggling families, drug addicts, and old folks who had long given up on life. The only companion Jack had was a black cat named Shadow. He had found Shadow one rainy night, shivering under a pile of trash bags. The cat had followed him home, curled up at the foot of his bed, and never left. Shadow was quiet and independent, but at night, he would jump onto Jack's lap and curl up, purring softly. Jack didn't know why, but having Shadow around made the apartment feel a little less empty. It was a cold night in late autumn when things started getting strange. Jack was sitting at the small wooden table in his kitchen, eating a bowl of instant noodles while Shadow sat nearby, licking his paw. Suddenly, Shadow's ears perked up, and he darted toward the door. Jack frowned, putting down his chopsticks. "What's up, Shadow?" Shadow meowed and walked toward the door. Jack stood up and followed. When he opened the door, Shadow was sitting proudly beside a bundle on the worn doormat. Jack bent down and his breath hitched in his throat. It was a stack of crisp, neatly wrapped $100 bills, at least a few $1,000s worth. Jack picked it up slowly, feeling the texture of the bills. His mind raced. Where the hell had Shadow found this? His eyes darted nervously down the hallway, but no one was there. He closed the door and locked it. Sitting back at the table, Jack counted the money, $5,000. He glanced at Shadow, who had settled back down near the radiator. "Where the hell did you get this?" he whispered. Shadow blinked lazily, curled his tail around his paws, and purred. Jack sat back in his chair, his pulse racing. The next morning, Jack walked down to the corner shop for a cup of coffee. The woman behind the counter, an older lady named Mrs. Johnson, smiled at him. "Morning, Jack," she said. "You look pale. You okay?" Jack hesitated. "Yeah, just didn't sleep well." He stirred his coffee, glancing at the people walking by the store window. A group of teenagers in hoodies were standing near the bus stop, smoking and laughing. Across the street, a man in a puffy jacket was talking to someone in a black car with tinted windows. It was the usual scene in the Bronx: drugs, poverty, and desperation. "Hey," Jack said suddenly, "has anyone lost any money around here?" Mrs. Johnson raised an eyebrow. "Money? In this neighborhood? Honey, nobody's got money to lose." Jack forced a smile and finished his coffee. He walked back home, still thinking about the money. It was too much to be random. Someone had to have left it there. But who, and why? That night, as Jack sat down to eat, Shadow jumped up onto the table, staring at him with his green eyes. Jack scratched behind his ear. "Where did you find that money?" "Huh?" Shadow's tail swayed. Then, without warning, he jumped down from the table and walked toward the bedroom. Jack watched as Shadow slipped under the bed. A few seconds later, Shadow returned, carrying another bundle of cash in his mouth. Jack shot to his feet. "Jesus, Shadow." He rushed over, taking the bundle from Shadow's mouth. Another $5,000. Jack stared at the money, his heart pounding. He dropped it onto the table, breathing heavily. What the hell is going on? Jack sat down, his hands trembling. He knew there was only one way to get answers. He needed to know where Shadow was getting the money from. Jack searched through his closet until he found an old security camera that he had installed years ago when someone broke into his apartment. He spent half an hour setting it up, positioning the camera to face his bedroom and the space beneath his bed. "Okay, Shadow," Jack muttered. "Let's see what you've been up to." That night, Jack turned off the lights and sat in front of his laptop, watching the live feed from the camera. Shadow was curled up on the windowsill. But around midnight, he stood up and stretched. Then, he walked toward the bed. Jack leaned forward, Shadow slid under the bed, and after a few seconds, his head reappeared, dragging a small fabric pouch between his teeth. Jack's eyes widened. He paused the video and crawled toward the bed. Lifting the mattress, he saw what Shadow had been working on. There was a small gap between the wooden floorboards beneath the bed. Shadow had scratched away the edges, revealing a dark compartment underneath. Jack reached down and pulled at the loose board. The compartment opened to reveal a wooden box, old and scratched. Jack pulled it out, setting it carefully on the bed. The box was heavy. His heart raced as he lifted the lid. Inside were stacks of $100 bills, tightly bound with faded rubber bands. Jack's mouth went dry. He pulled out the money and underneath it was an envelope, yellowed with age. Jack opened it carefully. Inside was a folded piece of paper. A letter. Jack, if you're reading this, it means I'm not here anymore. I've saved this money for you, bit by bit over the years. I never told you because I wanted you to stand on your own 2 feet. But if you've found it, it means you need it now. Use it wisely. Love, Mom. Jack's throat tightened. His hands shook as he folded the letter and held it to his chest. His mother had died nearly 10 years ago. He had always thought she left nothing behind, just a broken apartment and memories of their fights. But she had left this. She had been planning for him all along. Jack sank onto the bed, the letter still in his hand. Shadow jumped up beside him, pressing his soft body against Jack's side. Jack whispered, "Mom, I'm so sorry." Shadow curled up on his lap, and for the first time in years, Jack let the tears fall. Jack sat on the edge of his bed, the letter from his mother resting on his lap. His hands trembled as he folded the delicate paper and placed it back into the wooden box. The stacks of money lay on the bed beside him, crisp and neatly bundled. Tens of thousands of dollars. More money than Jack had seen in his entire life. Shadow sat next to the box, his tail flicking lazily as if he had nothing to do with the fact that Jack's life had just turned upside down. Jack scratched the back of his head, his mind racing. How the hell did you even find this?" Jack whispered, looking at Shadow. Shadow just stared at him with those wide, green eyes. Jack sighed and leaned back against the wall. His gaze drifted to the worn-out ceiling fan spinning slowly overhead. His apartment had always felt like a cage, a reminder of the life he'd built for himself after years of failure and bad decisions. But this money, it was enough to change everything. Or ruin it. Jack's mind wandered back to the last conversation he'd had with his mother. He was 22 at the time, fresh out of a mechanic apprenticeship and eager to open his own repair shop. His mother had told him it was a bad idea. "You don't know what you're getting into, Jack. You need more experience first." But Jack had been young, proud, and stupid. "You don't trust me," he had shouted at her. "You think I'm going to fail? Just like Dad, huh?" His mother had stood silently in the kitchen, her arms crossed. "I just don't want to see you get hurt, Jack. I don't need your help." And with that, he had left. He spent the next 3 years bouncing from one dead-end job to another, washing dishes, working in garages, and at one point, nearly getting arrested for fighting outside a bar. He came back only once, when he got a call from Mrs. Johnson telling him his mother was dying. By then, it was too late. She had been too weak to even sit up in bed. Jack had sat by her side, holding her hand, unable to find the right words. "I'm sorry, Mom," he had whispered. She had smiled weakly. "It's okay, Jack." And then she was gone. Jack squeezed his eyes shut, trying to push the memories away. But now, 10 years later, it turned out his mother had never given up on him, while he was out making mistakes and wasting years of his life. She had been saving for him, preparing for the day he would need her. "What the hell am I supposed to do now?" he muttered. Shadow meowed softly and rubbed against his leg. Jack sighed and picked up one of the stacks of bills. 50 grand, he whispered. Where the hell did she even get this kind of money? Jack stood up and started pacing. There was no way his mother had made this kind of money working as a cleaner. The letter didn't mention where it came from, only that she had saved it for him. Is it stolen money? Jack wondered. Did she borrow it from someone? A loan shark? He ran a hand through his hair. His mother had always been cautious with money. Hell, she used to wash out plastic bags and reuse them. There was no way she'd gotten mixed up in something illegal. But what if someone came looking for it? Jack sat down, his heart pounding. He needed answers. And he knew exactly where to start. Jack stood outside Mrs. Johnson's apartment door, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket. He could hear the sound of the television playing on the other side of the door, some talk show host laughing. He knocked. Just a second. A moment later, Mrs. Johnson opened the door. She was wearing an old house robe, her graying hair tied back with a scarf. She smiled when she saw him. Jack, this is a surprise. You okay? I need to ask you something. Mrs. Johnson's smile faded. Come on in. Jack stepped inside. Her apartment was small but cozy, cluttered with framed pictures of her grandkids and crocheted blankets draped over the back of the sofa. Sit down, honey. I'll put some tea on. Jack sat on the couch, his knee bouncing anxiously. Mrs. Johnson returned with 2 cups of tea and sat down beside him. So, she said, what's bothering you? Jack hesitated. Did my mom ever mention saving up money? Mrs. Johnson's face softened. Oh, so you found it. Jack's eyes widened. You knew? Mrs. Johnson sighed. Your mom, she was a proud woman. Jack, she didn't like asking for help, even when she needed it. After you left, she started working extra jobs, cleaning houses during the day, working at the laundromat at night. She even took in sewing work for some of the ladies at church. Jack swallowed. How much did she save? Mrs. Johnson hesitated. She never told me the full amount. But I know some of it came from a settlement. Jack's brow furrowed. Settlement? Mrs. Johnson nodded. Your dad's accident. Jack's chest tightened. I thought Dad didn't leave us anything. Well, your mother didn't want you to know. The settlement came years after his death, a workplace negligence claim. Your mom didn't spend any of it. She said it belonged to you. Jack felt like the air had been knocked out of his lungs. He leaned forward, rubbing his hands over his face. I didn't know. Mrs. Johnson's eyes softened. She was saving it for you, Jack, for when you were ready. Jack shook his head. I don't deserve this, after the way I treated her. Mrs. Johnson reached over and squeezed his hand. Jack, your mom loved you. She didn't care about the mistakes you made. She just wanted you to be okay. Jack's throat tightened. He pulled his hand away and stood up. Thank you for telling me. Mrs. Johnson smiled. What are you going to do with it? Jack hesitated. He looked toward the window, where the gray buildings of the Bronx stood under the cloudy sky. I don't know yet. Jack walked home through the dimly lit streets of the Bronx, his mind racing. His mother had left him a gift, a way out. He could finally leave this neighborhood. Hell, he could probably buy a small house somewhere out west. Start over. But the faces of the kids on the street haunted him. The ones hanging out near the bus stop, smoking. The ones wearing oversized jackets, walking with that hardened edge of someone who had already seen too much violence. Jack knew exactly what kind of future awaited them if nothing changed. He also knew he could change it. But why should I? Jack thought. Why should I sacrifice my chance for a better life? His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Joe, an old friend from his wilder days. Jack hesitated before answering. Hey, man. Joe's voice came through. Heard you came into some money. Jack's jaw tightened. Who told you that? Joe laughed. Small neighborhood. Jack, word travels fast. So, you need some help figuring out how to spend it? Jack sighed. I don't think so. Joe, come on, man. We could hit Vegas, double your money, or better yet, get out of this dump for good. Jack stared down the street at a group of kids sitting on the curb. He knew exactly what his mother would have wanted him to do. I'll think about it, Jack said, but he already knew the answer. Jack sat on the steps of his apartment building, a cigarette burning between his fingers. He wasn't a regular smoker, but tonight felt like the kind of night that called for it. Across the street, 2 kids in oversized jackets were passing around a joint. A police cruiser rolled by slowly, and the kids melted into the shadows. Shadow was curled up at Jack's feet, his tail flicking lazily. Jack took a slow drag from the cigarette and stared down the street. The Bronx had always been a hard place to live, but Jack had never known any different. He grew up in these streets, learned how to fight, learned how to survive, but now, for the first time, he had a way out. 50 grand, Jack thought. Hell, I could leave tonight, get on a bus, go west, California maybe. Start over. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't need to check the screen to know it was Joe. Jack sighed, took another drag, and picked up the call. Jack, Joe's voice came through, smooth and low. You had time to think about my offer? Jack rubbed his temple. I don't know, Joe. Look, man, 50 grand is nice, but you could make it 100, 200, easy. You just have to know how to play it. Jack's jaw tightened. And let me guess, you know how to play it? Joe laughed. Come on, Jack, you know how it works. I've got some contacts in Atlantic City. Hell, I know a guy who could turn that 50 into 200 grand in a weekend. Jack leaned his head back, blowing out a stream of smoke toward the cold night sky. And if I lose? Joe's voice darkened. Then you try again. Jack's eyes narrowed. Or I end up in debt to the wrong people. Joe chuckled. That's the game, Jack. Jack's grip on the phone tightened. He knew Joe. He'd known guys like him his whole life, the smooth talkers. The hustlers. The ones who always knew how to make a quick buck but never seemed to keep it. Jack knew exactly where that road led. Nah, Joe, he said, I'm good. There was a long pause. You sure about that? Joe asked. Jack looked down at Shadow, who was watching him with those deep green eyes. The cat's tail curled around his paws. Yeah, Jack said, I'm sure. Joe sighed. Suit yourself. Jack hung up and tossed the cigarette into the gutter. He sat there for a long time, listening to the distant sound of sirens. The next morning, Jack woke up to the sound of pounding on his door. Shadow hissed and darted under the couch. Jack rolled out of bed, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Yeah, hold on. He opened the door to find Detective Riley standing in the hallway. Riley was tall, sharp-featured, and had the kind of face that looked like it had seen too much of the world. His gray suit was wrinkled, and his badge glinted under the hallway light. Jack Miller? Jack frowned. Yeah? Riley pulled out a small notebook and flipped it open. Mind if I come in? Jack hesitated. What's this about? Riley smiled faintly. Why don't you let me in? And we'll talk about it. Jack stepped aside reluctantly and closed the door behind them. Riley took a seat at the small kitchen table and crossed his legs. You work at the repair shop down the street, right? Riley asked. Yeah. How long you been there? Couple of years. Riley nodded. Funny thing, couple of weeks ago, there was a robbery in Queens. Convenience store. The guy made off with about 50 grand in cash. Jack's spine stiffened. And yesterday, the convenience store owner got a call from someone saying they knew where the money was. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. You accusing me of something? Jack said. Riley smiled faintly. Not yet, but you can understand why it's suspicious. A guy like you, working at a repair shop for minimum wage, suddenly sitting on a pile of cash? Jack stood. I think you should leave. Riley didn't move. Where'd the money come from? Jack? Jack's fists clenched. It's none of your damn business. Actually, it is, Riley said, because if you don't have a good answer, this conversation is going to happen again, in an interrogation room. Jack's chest tightened. It's not stolen, he said through gritted teeth. Riley leaned back in his chair. Good, then I'm sure you won't mind if I look around. Jack stepped forward. You got a warrant? Riley smiled faintly. Not yet. Jack took a step toward him. Then get the hell out of my apartment. Riley stood, adjusting his tie. No problem, but let me give you a piece of advice. Jack, if you're sitting on dirty money, it's going to catch up with you sooner or later. Jack opened the door and gestured for him to leave. Riley smiled thinly as he stepped into the hallway. See you around, Jack. Jack slammed the door shut and locked it. He leaned against the wall, breathing hard. Shadow padded over, rubbing against his leg. Jack dropped down to the floor and ran his hand over Shadow's fur. This is bad, he whispered. Shadow meowed softly and climbed into Jack's lap. Jack closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He needed to figure out what to do with the money, fast. Jack sat at the repair shop later that day, disassembling an old fan. His hands moved automatically, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept replaying Riley's words in his head. If you're sitting on dirty money, it's going to catch up with you sooner or later. Joe's words came back to him too. Double your money. Jack cursed under his breath and put down the screwdriver. Across the street, he saw Mrs. Johnson helping a young mother carry her groceries up the steps of her apartment. The woman's coat was thin and patched in places. Her little boy, no older than 6, was clutching a ragged teddy bear. Jack stared at them for a long time. He thought about his mother, how she had worked herself to the bone to give him a chance at a better life. And what had he done with it? He'd thrown it away. Now, she was giving him a second chance. But was the money really meant for him, or was it meant for something bigger?
Barron's own
That
tightly
evening,
controlled
Jack
exterior.
found himself walking
He sat
toward
at the head
St.
of the
Mary's
table,
Community
the
Center
very
at the edge
picture
of
of
the
a
neighborhood.
successful entrepreneur.
He had passed by the place 100
eager
times,
to
but had
partake
never
in his
gone
latest
inside.
venture, a
It was a
revolutionary
small,
AI start.
brick building with a faded sign above the door. Jack pushed open the door. Inside, a few folding tables were set up, and a woman was handing out meals to a line of homeless men and women. A man in a white shirt and tie was stacking boxes nearby. "Can I help you?" the man asked. Jack hesitated. I want to make a donation." The man smiled. "Sure, we accept cash or check." Jack pulled the bundle of money from his jacket pocket and set it on the table. The man's eyes widened. You're serious?" Jack nodded. The man picked up the bundle and flipped through the bills. "This is 10 grand. Jack shrugged. "It's a start." The man stared at him. "What's your name?" Jack smiled faintly. "Jack Miller." The man extended his hand. "You just changed a lot of lives." Jack shook his hand. "I hope so." As Jack turned to leave, Shadow rubbed against his leg and let out a soft purr. Jack reached down and scratched behind his ear. "Let's see if we can make this a habit," Jack said. Shadow meowed in agreement.
The boardroom was a fortress of glass and steel, mirroring Barron's own tightly controlled exterior. He sat at the head of the table, the very picture of a successful entrepreneur. Investors, eager to partake in his latest venture, a revolutionary AI startup, hung on his every word. But Barron's mind was elsewhere, a flicker of unease tugging at his composure. He glanced at his phone, trying to ignore the incessant vibrations. It was a critical moment, the culmination of years of hard work. Yet,
Ethan
the
Carter
persistent
sat behind
buzz
the
felt
wheel
like
of his
a warning.
patrol car.
Finally, he succumbed. The message flashed across the screen. "She's in danger. You can't abandon her." The words, stark and anonymous, hit him with unexpected force. He hadn't thought of her in years. Not consciously. Mrs. Henderson. The name echoed in the corridors of his memory. A mix of gratitude and unresolved guilt. She had been his mentor, his guide, the only person who had ever truly believed in him. He owed her everything, and he knew it. The room swam back into focus, the murmur of investment possibilities fading. He was torn. The deal was on the brink of sealing, potentially setting him up for life. But the message, it was a call to duty, a debt to repay. The decision slammed into him with the force of a tidal wave. He had to go. "Gentlemen," he announced, his voice firm despite the turmoil within. "I must excuse myself. An urgent matter has arisen." He didn't elaborate, didn't need to. His reputation for decisiveness and unwavering focus was enough to quell any immediate questioning. He stood, pushing his chair back with a screech that momentarily shattered the polished veneer of the room. He moved swiftly, heading for the elevator. Outside, the city throbbed with life. Oblivious to the drama unfolding within him, he hailed a cab and gave the driver an address in the grittier part of town, an area he hadn't visited in years. As the cab sped through the streets, Barron's mind raced. What had happened to Mrs. Henderson? Why was she in danger? The questions tumbled over each other, fueled by a growing sense of dread. The cab lurched to a halt in a narrow, dimly lit alleyway. It was a world away from the pristine boardroom. A group of figures huddled in the shadows, their voices low and menacing. As Barron approached, he saw her. Mrs. Henderson, frail and vulnerable, was being cornered by a group of thugs. Her eyes, once bright with wisdom, were now clouded with fear. He had arrived just in time. Without a second thought, Barron plunged into the fray, adrenaline surging through him. Barron moved with a speed and ferocity that surprised even himself. Years of corporate battles had honed his instincts, and he knew how to use his size to his advantage. The thugs, caught off guard by his sudden intervention, scattered like rats, He stood protectively in front of Mrs. Henderson, his body shielding her from further harm. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. She looked up at him, her eyes widening in disbelief. "Baron, is that really you?" Her voice was a mere whisper, tinged with a mixture of relief and shock. He helped her to her feet. She was thin, almost gaunt, and her clothes were worn and ill-fitting. The years had not been kind. He had always known her as a force of nature, someone who could weather any storm. But now, she looked broken, defeated. "What happened?" he asked, his voice filled with compassion. She shook her head, her eyes darting around as if she expected the thugs to return at any moment. "It's a long story," she said, her voice trembling, "one I'm not sure I'm ready to tell." He knew better than to push her. Instead, he led her out of the alley and into his waiting cab. He took her to a small, discreet hotel he knew, far from the glittering towers of the city center. He booked a room for her, making sure it was clean and comfortable. He knew it wasn't much, but it was a start. In the hotel room, Mrs. Henderson finally began to relax, but a cloud of sadness still lingered in her eyes. She had nowhere to go, nothing to her name, and was being hunted. He offered her food, but she only picked at it, her appetite gone. He sat with her, listening as she began to slowly unravel the story of her downfall. Her family had turned on her, embezzling her fortune and leaving her destitute. She had spent the last few years drifting, trying to survive on the streets. "Why didn't you come to me?" Baron asked, his voice filled with pain. She looked away, her eyes glistening with tears. "I didn't want to burden you," she said softly. "You had your own life to live." He understood, but it didn't make it any easier to hear. He vowed to help her, to make things right, but as he left the hotel that night, a sense of foreboding settled over him. He knew that getting involved in Mrs. Henderson's life would have consequences. And he had a strong feeling that those consequences would be far-reaching and severe. That night as he lay in bed, he got a notification that she was trying to sneak out, and his adrenaline rose again. He had to stop her. He found her attempting to open a window to escape the hotel room. Seeing him, she collapsed. She was tired of running. "You can't keep running," Baron said, his voice a blend of concern and frustration. "They'll just keep finding you." Mrs. Henderson slumped against the wall, her body trembling. "What else can I do?" she asked, her voice filled with despair. "They've taken everything from me. Everything." He knelt down beside her, taking her hand in his. "I'm not going to let them," he said, his voice firm. "I'm going to help you get your life back." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "But, why? You have your own life, your own career. Why would you risk everything for me?" He looked at her, his heart aching. "Because you helped me when I had nothing," he said softly. "You believed in me when no one else did. I owe you everything, and I don't abandon the people I care about." He spent the next few days trying to help her, getting her new clothes and a new phone. But he still hadn't dealt with her money issues. She looked more comfortable, but also more wary, like she knew the storm was coming. Baron's friends and investors were less than thrilled with his decision to help Mrs. Henderson. They saw her as a liability, a distraction from his business goals. One powerful investor, a man named Wilkes, even confronted him directly. "You're throwing your life away for some homeless old woman," Wilkes said, his voice laced with contempt. "You could lose everything, your company, your reputation, everything you've worked for." Baron met his gaze, unflinching. "She's not just some homeless old woman," he said, his voice cold. "She's a human being, and she needs my help. And I will help her, even if it means losing everything." Wilkes scoffed. "You're a fool, Baron," he said, shaking his head. "You'll regret this." Baron ignored him, turning his back and walking away. He knew that Wilkes was right. Helping Mrs. Henderson would come at a cost, but he was willing to pay it. He couldn't turn his back on her, not after everything she had done for him. But in the back of his mind, he knew that there was more to this story than Mrs. Henderson was letting on. What could have possibly driven her family, the people she loved, to betray her so completely? He would have to find out. The internal conflict gnawed at Baron. He was a businessman, driven by logic and numbers. Helping Mrs. Henderson was an act of pure emotion, a defiance of all the principles he had lived by. He found himself increasingly distracted, unable to focus on his work. He agreed to an interview, trying to regain his public image from the accusations. A tabloid reporter, known for his ruthlessness, asked him about Mrs. Henderson. He spun the story to his advantage, hoping the public would be swayed by his words. Instead, the truth about Mrs. Henderson's life was revealed to the public. It had the opposite effect. The public called her an unreliable woman, and turned the interviewer against Barron. As the media scrutiny intensified, Barron's investors grew increasingly nervous. They saw him as a liability, a distraction from his business goals. One by one, they began to withdraw their support. Barron stood by her, defending her against the attacks. But his efforts were in vain. The damage was done. His reputation was tarnished. His company was teetering on the brink, and he was rapidly losing everything he had worked for. Barron started digging. He had to know what was going on. With each layer of information that he uncovered, he felt as though the world was against Mrs. Henderson. During his research, he hired a private investigator, who found the most heinous crime. Mrs. Henderson had a child, a son, but he was missing. There was not a single trace. Barron decided to confront Mrs. Henderson with his finding and was met with a fit of tears. He pressed her for information, but she was reluctant to give anything. She kept mumbling about how it was her fault, that she had failed as a parent. It was that moment when she felt like she had lost it all. He also uncovered another secret. Her daughter, the woman who betrayed her and left her for dead. But why? He decided to pay the daughter a visit. This is the start of the story. Let me know if you'd like me to continue, or if you have any specific elements you'd like me to include. The daughter's house was a stark contrast to Mrs. Henderson's current state. Opulent, modern, and cold, it screamed of money and success. Barron rang the doorbell, and the door was opened by a woman who could have been a younger, hardened version of Mrs. Henderson. Her name was Eleanor. "What do you want?" Eleanor asked, her voice sharp and unwelcoming. "I'm here about your mother," Barron said, his voice calm but firm. Eleanor's face hardened. "I have nothing to say about her." She started to close the door, but Barron stopped her. "I know what you did," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "I know you were involved in her downfall." Eleanor's facade cracked for a moment, a flicker of fear crossing her face. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice trembling. "Don't lie to me," Barron said, his voice low and dangerous. "I know you and your family embezzled her fortune. I know you left her to fend for herself." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "So what?" She was old news. She was holding us back. We deserved that money. Barron fought to control his anger. "She's your mother," he said, his voice incredulous. "How could you do that to her?" Eleanor shrugged. "Family is overrated. Money is what matters." Barron turned to leave, disgusted. Before he reached the gates, Eleanor called out to him. She had a proposition. If he agreed to sell his company over to them, she would tell him about the location of her brother. In exchange, he would forget about what happened to their mother. He refused, and left, making Eleanor even more infuriated. Meanwhile, Mr. Wilkes approached Barron with an offer of his own. If Barron was to sign a contract with him and cut contact with Mrs. Henderson, he would allow his investors to return. If not, he would be ruined. He declined the offer, resulting in him losing a $1 million contract. Barron's refusal to cave to Wilkes and Eleanor only intensified the pressure on him. The media, fueled by Wilkes's influence, launched a full-scale assault on his character, painting him as a naive fool, a bleeding heart who was throwing away his future for a lost cause. Just when he thought things couldn't get any worse, a new player entered the game, a dogged investigative reporter named Kenner. He had made a name for himself by exposing corruption and scandal, and he saw Mrs. Henderson as his next target. Kenner approached Barron with a proposition. Help him uncover the truth about Mrs. Henderson, and he'd give Barron a chance to defend her. But Barron sensed a trap. He knew Kenner was only interested in sensationalism, and he was afraid of what the reporter might unearth. Kenner found something regardless. He discovered a dark secret. Mrs. Henderson had been suspected of stealing money from a charity organization years ago. The allegations had never been proven, but the stain remained. Kenner threatened to expose this information, painting Mrs. Henderson as a fraud and a thief. Barron was faced with a terrible choice: help Kenner uncover the truth, risking further damage to Mrs. Henderson's reputation, or remain silent and let her face the accusations alone. He knew he had to protect her, but he also knew that the truth, whatever it might be, had a way of coming out eventually. The charity scandal erupted in the media, turning public opinion even further against Mrs. Henderson. She was summoned to court to answer questions about the allegations. Barron desperately tried to find evidence to clear her name, but everything seemed to be working against them. The documents were gone, witnesses were unavailable, and the trail had gone cold. The pressure was too much for Mrs. Henderson. She was already emotionally and physically fragile, and the weight of the accusations threatened to break her. She told Barron to give up, that she was tired of fighting. She wanted to go home. It seemed she was ready to give up on life. Barron refused to let her. He reminded her of the lessons she had taught him as a child. The lessons about perseverance, integrity, and the importance of standing up for what is right. He quoted all her favorite lines, reminding her of the words he had been taught to live by. He told her that he believed in her, and he begged her to believe in herself. "You taught me never to give up," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "And I'm not giving up on you." His words seemed to reach her, and she agreed to keep fighting. But Barron knew that time was running out. He had to find something, anything, to clear her name before it was too late. As Barron continued his investigation, he stumbled upon a shocking revelation. Eleanor, Mrs. Henderson's daughter, was the one who had orchestrated the entire campaign against her. She had planted the seeds of doubt about the charity, leaked the information to Kenner, and manipulated the media to turn public opinion against her mother. She was the reason for her downfall. He went back to her house, the cold and pristine place, and confronted Eleanor. The fight began. She tried to justify her actions, claiming that her mother had always favored her brother, always seen her as second best. She resented Mrs. Henderson, and she wanted to make her pay. "I did what I had to do," Eleanor said, her voice cold and unapologetic. "She deserved it." Mrs. Henderson, who had accompanied Barron, finally spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it was filled with pain. "How could you do this to me?" she asked, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm your mother." Eleanor shrugged. "You were never really a mother to me," she said. "You only cared about yourself and brother's name." The confrontation escalated, with harsh words, accusations, and recriminations flying between mother and daughter. But even as she stood there, Mrs. Henderson still pleaded for her daughter to take back her actions. Eleanor refused. "I'll stop here for now. Let me know if you want me to continue. We're getting closer to the climax and resolution." The pieces finally fell into place. Barron raced against time, gathering the final pieces of evidence that would exonerate Mrs. Henderson. He found a former employee of the charity who had witnessed Eleanor planting false documents and spreading rumors. He convinced the employee to testify in court, risking their own safety to tell the truth. The courtroom was packed, the atmosphere thick with tension. The employee took the stand, revealing Eleanor's treachery. The truth came pouring out, exposing Eleanor's lies and clearing Mrs. Henderson's name. The judge dismissed the charges, declaring Mrs. Henderson innocent. But the victory felt hollow. Mrs. Henderson was vindicated, but she was also broken. The betrayal by her own daughter had shattered her heart, leaving her feeling lost and alone. She had lost her family, her fortune, and her reputation. Even though she'd cleared her name, the scars remained. One night, Mrs. Henderson disappeared from the hotel. Barron searched frantically, his heart pounding with fear. He found a note she had left behind, a farewell letter filled with despair. She had lost everything, and she couldn't go on. She said that the world was cruel, and that the pain was too much for her to bear. A frantic race against time began, as Barron tried to retrace her steps. He drove around the city, searching for her, calling her name into the darkness. Hours passed, and his hope began to dwindle. He found her. She was wandering in the rain, on the brink of despair. He rushed to her side, his voice filled with desperation. He urged her not to give up, to not let Eleanor win. He reminded her of all the people who loved her, of the impact she had had on his life. He shared stories of his success. He told her that she was the reason for who he was. They talked for hours, a deep, soul-bearing conversation about forgiveness, loss, and hope. He convinced her that life was still worth living, that she still had something to offer the world. She agreed to continue living, to fight for a new beginning. After that night, she started to get sick, due to the rain, and her frail body was not strong enough to make it through. One morning, Barron found Mrs. Henderson peacefully asleep in her bed. She had passed away in her sleep, her face serene and calm. In her hands, she held a note, a final message to Baron. She thanked him for giving her a second chance at life, for showing her kindness and compassion when she needed it most. She told him that he had been the son she never had, and that she was proud of the man he had become. She encouraged him to continue living a life of purpose and to never lose sight of his values. Baron grieved deeply, but he also knew that Mrs. Henderson had found peace. She had faced unimaginable hardship, but she had never lost her spirit, her kindness, or her hope. She had left a lasting legacy, a testament to the power of love and compassion. Inspired by Mrs. Henderson's life, Baron decided to dedicate himself to helping others. He established a foundation in her name, providing assistance to the homeless and vulnerable. He used his wealth and influence to advocate for social justice, fighting for a world where everyone had a chance to thrive. He resigned from his company, selling his assets and donating it all to the foundation, deciding that what he had was enough. He knew that he could not make up for the suffering that Mrs. Henderson had endured, but he could honor her memory by making a difference in the lives of others. Years passed. Baron stood before a portrait of Mrs. Henderson, a gentle smile on his face. He read the lessons she had taught him, the words that had shaped his life. A saying that she told him echoed in his mind: sometimes, the smallest things can change a person's whole life. Baron walked out onto the street, a man transformed. He carried Mrs. Henderson's legacy with him, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope, always love, and always the possibility of redemption.
Ethan Carter sat behind the wheel of his patrol car, the hum of the radio filling the quiet night. Willow Creek was a small town, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's name. After 20 years on the force, Ethan had learned that most trouble in Willow Creek was minor: a bar fight, a stolen bicycle, or the occasional teenager sneaking beer into the park. But the call he received that night was different. All units, report to 1456 Willow Street. Possible abandonment case. Multiple minors involved. Ethan's jaw tightened as he flipped on the siren and sped toward the address. Willow Street wasn't exactly the best part of town. It was lined with worn-down houses and peeling paint, the kind of place where people struggled to make ends meet. As Ethan pulled up to the house, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. The porch light flickered. The windows were dark. He stepped out of the car, the cool night air biting at his skin. From inside the house, he could hear it faint crying. High-pitched and desperate. His hand instinctively moved toward his gun as he approached the door. Police. Is anyone inside? No answer, just the sound of sobbing. Ethan pushed the door open, and his breath caught in his throat. 6 children. Huddled together in the corner of the dimly lit room were 6 little girls, the oldest looking about 12, the youngest no older than 4. They clung to each other, their wide eyes brimming with fear. The room was practically empty: a worn-out couch pushed against the wall, a broken coffee table littered with empty cans and torn papers. The oldest girl, dark braids falling across her shoulders, stood protectively in front of the others. Her chin lifted in quiet defiance despite the fear in her eyes. "It's okay," Ethan said, lowering his voice as he crouched down. "I'm here to help." The girl didn't move. Her gaze was sharp, guarded. "Who are you?" Ethan asked softly. "Amaya," she said, her voice steady. "And these are my sisters. Lena, Sierra, Tiana, Ava and Jasmine. Where are your parents?" Amaya's face darkened. "They're not coming back." Ethan's heart twisted painfully. "Do you have any other family we can call?" Amaya shook her head. "Then where have you been staying?" "Here," Amaya whispered. "We were waiting for them to come back." Ethan took a deep breath. He knew how the system worked. If there was no next of kin, these girls would be separated, scattered into different foster homes. And 6 girls. They'd never be kept together. "We can't stay here," Ethan said. "I'm going to take you somewhere safe." Amaya's eyes narrowed. "Together. Together." Amaya studied him for a long moment before giving him a reluctant nod. Slowly, the other girls began to emerge from behind her, their small hands clutching each other's shirts. "Come on," Ethan said softly, holding out his hand. "Let's get you home." As he led them outside to the car, Jasmine, the youngest, slipped her hand into his. Ethan's heart swelled painfully as he helped them into the back seat. As he drove them toward the station, Amaya's voice cut through the quiet. "Are you going to send us away?" "No," Ethan said. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "I'll figure something out." And as he glanced into the rearview mirror, seeing 6 sets of frightened eyes watching him, something shifted in his chest. He didn't know why, but he was already certain. He wasn't letting them go. Ethan's house had been quiet for years. After his wife passed away, the silence became a strange comfort, a familiar loneliness. But now it was chaos. Lena and Sierra were arguing over a spot on the couch. Ava was sitting on the floor playing with a stuffed animal, while Jasmine followed Ethan around the house like a shadow. Amaya stood near the window, arms crossed, eyes distant. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, standing in the center of the room. He'd been a cop for 20 years, faced down armed criminals and saved lives, but this was uncharted territory. "All right," Ethan said, trying to sound confident. "Let's get some dinner." He opened the fridge and immediately realized 2 things. He had no idea what 6 little girls would eat. He hadn't gone grocery shopping in a week. "Mac and cheese," he offered weakly. Amaya's sharp gaze slid toward him. "Is that all you have?" Ethan sighed. "It's what I've got." Sierra scrunched her nose. "I don't like cheese." "Well, what do you want?" "Rice and chicken," Amaya said. Ethan frowned. "I don't know how to make that. Mom used to make it with onions and peppers." Ethan hesitated. Then he nodded. "All right. Let's give it a shot." An hour later, the kitchen was a disaster. There was rice stuck to the stove, and Ethan was pretty sure he'd overcooked the chicken. He sat the plates down in front of the girls, prepared for them to hate it. Amaya took a bite. Her gaze met his across the table. "It's not terrible." Ethan smiled. Sierra grinned. "It's actually kind of good." Ava and Lena nodded in agreement. "You know," Ethan said, leaning back, "I might get the hang of this." That night, as Ethan was turning off the lights, Amaya's voice stopped him. "Ethan." "Yeah. Thanks." Ethan's heart squeezed. "For what?" "For trying." He smiled into the dark. "Anytime, kid." And for the first time since his wife passed, Ethan Carter fell asleep not to the sound of silence but to the soft, steady breathing of his new family. Monday morning arrived with a sharp chill in the air. All right, first day, Ethan said as he adjusted the rear-view mirror. Everybody ready? No one answered. Ethan sighed. Okay, then. Let's go. The drive to Willow Creek Elementary was quiet. Amaya stared out the window, her face set in stone. Tiana sat with her arms wrapped tightly around herself, jaw clenched. Sierra was nervously fidgeting with the hem of her jacket. As Ethan pulled up to the school, the reality of the situation hit him hard. Willow Creek was a predominantly white town. There were very few black families, and none of them were as large or as visible as Ethan's new household. Amaya's gaze darkened as the other students started staring the moment they stepped out of the car. Some whispered behind cupped hands. Others openly gawked. Ethan crouched down next to Amaya, putting a hand on her shoulder. Hey. It's going to be okay. Amaya's expression didn't soften. You don't know that. You're right, Ethan said. But you've got each other. And you've got me. Amaya's eyes softened, but the hardness didn't disappear completely. She gave him a small nod before leading the others toward the front door. Ethan watched them go, his heart heavy. But things unraveled faster than he expected. Later that afternoon. You need to come down to the school immediately. Ethan's heart dropped at the sound of the principal's sharp tone over the phone. He grabbed his jacket and drove straight to the school. When he walked into the principal's office, he found Tiana sitting in a chair, her arms crossed and her expression set in defiance. Across from her was Coach Miller, his face twisted in anger. Mr. Carter, the principal began. We have a situation. Ethan's eyes narrowed. What happened? Tiana was involved in a fight during gym class. Ethan's gaze slid toward Tiana. She sat stiffly in her chair, her eyes dark and cold. Is that true? Ethan asked. Tiana's jaw tightened. I didn't start it. She was disrespecting the other students, Coach Miller interrupted. Aggressive. And when one of the boys called her a name, she hit him. What name? Ethan's voice sharpened. Coach Miller hesitated. It's not important. It's important to me. Tiana's face darkened. Her lips pressed into a hard line. He called me the N-word. The room went cold. Ethan's eyes flashed toward Coach Miller, whose expression immediately turned defensive. We have a zero-tolerance policy for violence, the principal said carefully. We're suspending her for 3 days. Ethan's voice was low and dangerous. You're suspending her for defending herself against a racial slur. Rules are rules, Coach Miller said dismissively. But I guess it's okay for one of your students to call her that. We're addressing that separately. Separately. Ethan scoffed. So Tiana gets suspended while the kid who insulted her gets a slap on the wrist. It's complicated, the principal said, clearly uncomfortable. No, Ethan growled. It's not. Ethan crouched down beside Tiana, meeting her eyes. What happened? He said I didn't belong here, Tiana whispered, her voice trembling with barely contained anger. That I should go back to where I came from. And I told him to shut up, but he wouldn't stop. So I hit him. Ethan swallowed the wave of rage rising inside him. He took a deep breath and gently took Tiana's hand. You're not in trouble with me, Ethan said softly. And you do belong here. Tiana's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly blinked them away. Mr. Carter, you need to control your daughter's behavior, Coach Miller said. Ethan stood slowly, his expression dangerously calm. Let me be clear, Ethan said, his voice low. Tiana isn't the one who needs to learn how to behave. If you think I'm going to let you punish her for standing up for herself, you're out of your damn mind. Coach Miller's face darkened. Mr. Carter. This conversation is over, Ethan cut him off. He took Tiana's hand and led her toward the door. Ethan, the principal started. File whatever complaint you want, Ethan snapped. But if you think I'm going to let you treat my daughter this way, you don't know me very well. Tiana's head whipped toward him. Your daughter? Ethan stopped walking. His chest tightened. He hadn't meant to say it, but it had slipped out naturally, without hesitation. Tiana's lips parted slightly, her expression unreadable. Come on, Ethan said, his voice soft. Let's go home. That night, Tiana sat at the edge of the couch, her hands wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate. Did you mean it? She asked quietly. Mean what? Ethan sat down next to her. When you called me your daughter. Ethan's throat tightened. He hesitated, then said, yes. Tiana's eyes shone with what might have been tears. She looked down at her mug, her expression unreadable. No one's ever stood up for me like that, she said. Get used to it, Ethan said softly. Because I'm not going anywhere. Slowly, Tiana's hand slipped into his. Thanks. Dad. Ethan froze. Tiana's gaze stayed on the floor, but the word was clear and deliberate. His heart twisted painfully in his chest as he squeezed her hand. Anytime, sweetheart. Ethan sat there long after Tiana had gone to bed, his heart still racing. He'd walked into that school as a single man trying to do the right thing. He left knowing, for the first time, that he wasn't just a man taking care of 6 girls. He was their father. Ethan's house had always been quiet. Too quiet. But not anymore. Now, it was filled with the sounds of footsteps racing down the hall, the buzz of overlapping conversations, the occasional slam of a bedroom door, and the constant murmur of life. But lately, the noise had changed. It was sharper. Tense. Fractured. Ethan stood at the kitchen sink, washing dishes while listening to the sounds of another argument unfolding down the hall. Amaya's voice, sharp and cutting. Tiana's voice, loud and angry. You think you know everything. At least I'm not acting like a victim. I'm not a victim. Then stop acting like one. Ethan sighed and set down the dish. This was the 3rd fight this week. Amaya and Tiana had always been the most independent, the most guarded. But since the school incident, things had been spiraling. Girls. Ethan called. No response. The shouting continued. Hey. Ethan's voice sharpened as he walked toward the hallway. He found them in the living room, standing inches apart. Amaya's fists were clenched at her sides, her eyes blazing. Tiana's jaw was set in angry defiance. Enough. Ethan's voice was sharp and commanding. What the hell is going on? Tiana's face was flushed with anger. She thinks I should have just let that kid say whatever he wanted to me. I didn't say that, Amaya shot back. But maybe punching someone isn't the solution to every problem. And what should I have done, huh? Tiana's eyes narrowed. Let him walk all over me. I'm saying you need to be smart about it. Oh, I get it, Tiana's lips curled bitterly. You want me to be quiet? You want me to just sit there and take it like you do? Amaya's eyes flashed dangerously. You don't know what the hell you're talking about. I know exactly what I'm talking about. Tiana yelled. I'm not weak. Amaya's face twisted. Neither am I. That's enough. Ethan's voice boomed through the room, cutting through the tension like a knife. Both girls flinched and turned toward him. I don't care who started it, Ethan said, his voice dangerously low. I don't care who's right or wrong. What I care about is that you're sisters. And you will not stand here and tear each other apart in my house. Tiana's chest heaved. Amaya's fist slowly unclenched. Tiana, Ethan said, softening his tone, go cool off. Now. Tiana's gaze lingered on Amaya for a long, tense second. Then, with a sharp shake of her head, she stormed down the hall and slammed her bedroom door. Ethan ran a hand down his face. His heart was still pounding. What the hell is going on with you two? He asked Amaya. Amaya's gaze darkened. She's reckless. She acts without thinking. And you don't. Amaya's lips tightened. I don't make trouble. I survive. Surviving isn't the same as living, Ethan said. And sometimes, fighting back is the only way to survive. Amaya's gaze softened but only slightly. She's going to get herself hurt. And you think you can protect her by pushing her away? Amaya's jaw tightened. Someone has to be strong. Ethan's chest ached at the weight of her words. He knew where it came from. Amaya had taken on the role of protector since the day they lost their parents. She was the shield, the quiet strength behind her sisters. Amaya, it's not your job to carry everything. Amaya's gaze sharpened. If I don't, who will? Ethan reached out, resting his hand on her shoulder. I will, he said softly. You don't have to do this alone anymore. Amaya's eyes shone with unshed tears, but she shook her head and pulled away. I'm fine, she said, her voice stiff. We don't need you to save us. Ethan's heart twisted. Maybe not. But you need someone to have your back. Amaya's expression flickered. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Amaya turned toward the stairs. I'll talk to her, Ethan said. Amaya hesitated. Good luck. Later that night, Ethan knocked gently on Tiana's bedroom door. No answer. He opened it slowly and found her curled up on the bed, arms wrapped around her knees. Can I come in? Tiana shrugged. Ethan sat down at the edge of the bed. Wanna tell me what that was about? Tiana didn't answer. Ethan sighed. Tiana, I'm not mad. I need to understand. Tiana's jaw tightened. She thinks I'm reckless. She's scared. Tiana's head snapped toward him. Of what? Of losing you. Tiana's mouth parted slightly. Amaya has been holding everything together since the day you lost your parents, Ethan said quietly. But now she's not alone anymore. And that scares her. Tiana swallowed hard. She thinks I'm weak. No, Ethan said firmly. She thinks you're strong. But you're not invincible. Tiana's expression softened. Her lips trembled. I hate how they look at me. I know. And it's not going to stop, is it? Ethan's chest tightened painfully. No. It's not. Tiana's eyes filled with tears. Then what am I supposed to do? Ethan's hand slid over hers. You face it? How? With your sisters. And with me. A tear slipped down Tiana's cheek. I don't know if I can. You can. How do you know? Ethan smiled faintly. Because you already have. Tiana's gaze searched his face. Slowly, she leaned forward and rested her head against his shoulder. Ethan's arms wrapped around her, holding her tightly. I've got you, he whispered. I've always got you. Tiana's breath hitched. Promise, she whispered. Promise. Ethan sat there for a long time, holding his daughter as she cried. He knew this wasn't over. The road ahead would be long, and the battles would keep coming. But they would face them together. Ethan's hands were shaking. He stood outside the principal's office, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. Through the glass window, he could see Tiana sitting across from the principal, her head bowed and her shoulders hunched forward. It was happening again. He inhaled deeply, trying to steady his racing heart. Stay calm, he whispered to himself. Stay calm for her. The door swung open, and the principal, Mrs. Carter, stepped out. A thin woman with sharp eyes and a severe expression, she looked at Ethan with the kind of tired annoyance that made his blood boil. Mr. Carter, please come in. Ethan stepped into the office. Tiana didn't look up. Sit, Mrs. Carter said briskly, gesturing toward the chair next to Tiana. Ethan sat down, resting his hand lightly on Tiana's back. What happened? He asked, his tone low and controlled. Mrs. Carter sat down behind her desk, folding her hands in front of her. Tiana was involved in another altercation. Ethan's jaw tightened. What kind of altercation? Mrs. Carter's eyes narrowed. She punched another student. Ethan's gaze slid toward Tiana. She was looking at the floor, her lips pressed together. Why? Ethan asked carefully. Because he wouldn't stop calling me names, Tiana said, her voice quiet but sharp. Ethan's heart twisted painfully. What names? Tiana's hands curled into fists. The same ones as before. Mrs. Carter sighed. Mr. Carter, I understand your concern, but we cannot tolerate physical violence in this school. And what about the kid who insulted her? We'll be handling that separately. Handling it? Ethan's voice sharpened. You mean another slap on the wrist? Mrs. Carter's gaze hardened. I'm sorry, but the rules are clear. Tiana will be suspended for 5 days. Tiana's head shot up. What? You've got to be kidding me, Ethan said coldly. I'm not, Mrs. Carter said flatly. We have a zero-tolerance policy for violence. And for racism? Ethan asked. Mrs. Carter's mouth pressed into a thin line. We're working on improving that. Ethan's jaw tightened. That's not good enough. I'm sorry you feel that way, Mrs. Carter said stiffly. Ethan stood, his eyes flashing with anger. Come on, Tiana. Tiana hesitated. Am I really suspended? Yes, Mrs. Carter said. Ethan's hand settled protectively on Tiana's back. We're leaving. Mr. Carter, this will go on her record. And I'll make sure it comes off, Ethan said icily. Mrs. Carter's gaze sharpened. Threatening the school board won't help you. It's not a threat, Ethan said darkly. It's a promise. Tiana followed Ethan out of the office without another word. In the car. They sat in silence for a long time. Tiana stared out the window, her jaw tight and her arms crossed over her chest. Ethan gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. I'm proud of you, he said finally. Tiana's gaze slid toward him. Why? I got suspended. You stood up for yourself. And now I'm in trouble. That's not your fault. Tiana's hands curled into fists. Then why does it feel like it is? Ethan's chest tightened painfully. He pulled the car over to the side of the road and turned toward her. Because that's what this world wants you to believe, he said softly. That you're the problem. That you're too loud or too angry or too different. Tiana's eyes filled with tears. But they're wrong, Ethan said. You hear me? They are wrong. Tiana swallowed hard. It's not fair, she whispered. I know, Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. But you're not alone anymore. Slowly, Tiana reached for his hand. Ethan squeezed her fingers tightly. I'm tired of fighting, she said softly. Then let me fight for you. Tiana's lower lip trembled. Okay, she whispered. That night, Amaya was waiting for them when they got home. What happened? She asked immediately. Tiana rolled her eyes. Suspended. Amaya's eyes narrowed. Why? Because some kid called me a name and I punched him. Amaya sighed. Tiana. Don't start, Tiana snapped. I'm not apologizing for defending myself. You shouldn't have had to. Tiana's head whipped toward her. What? Amaya's gaze hardened. That's the problem. You shouldn't have had to defend yourself in the first place. Tiana's eyes widened. What they did was wrong, Amaya said. And so is punishing you for it? Tiana blinked rapidly. You think I was right? Amaya hesitated. I think you shouldn't have had to fight in the first place. Tiana's face twisted. Well, I did. And I'm sorry for that, Amaya said quietly. Tiana's eyes softened. Slowly, Amaya extended her hand. After a long pause, Tiana took it. Ethan watched them from across the room, his heart lifting slightly. Small steps. All right, he said, standing. Family meeting. Living room. Now. The girls groaned but gathered on the couch anyway. Ethan stood before them, his arms crossed. We're going to figure this out together, he said. Because what happened today isn't just about Tiana. It's not. Sierra asked. No. Ethan's gaze darkened. This is about all of you. About how this town sees you. About how people treat you. Amaya's jaw tightened. And how are you going to fix that? We're not going to fix it, Ethan said simply. But we're not going to let it break us either. Tiana's gaze sharpened. What are you saying? I'm saying that if this town wants to see us as outsiders, let them. Amaya's eyes narrowed. And we'll show them why they're wrong. Tiana smiled faintly. How? Ethan's expression darkened with quiet determination. We fight back. By hitting people. Lena asked. No, Ethan said. By being better than them. By succeeding in spite of them. And when they push you down. We stand back up, Amaya said quietly. Ethan nodded. Together. A quiet strength filled the room. Amaya leaned back into the couch, a small smile pulling at her lips. So, what's the plan? Ethan's smile was dark and sharp. First, he said. We're getting that suspension overturned. Tiana's lips curled into a smile. And after that? Ethan's smile sharpened. We show this town exactly who they're dealing with. The morning sunlight filtered through the living room window, casting a warm glow across the floorboards. Ethan stood by the window, his hands resting on his hips as he stared at the street outside. The town was waking up. Neighbors walking their dogs. Kids biking down the sidewalk. Parents loading their kids into cars for school. But beneath the quiet surface, Ethan could feel the tension simmering. Tiana's suspension hadn't gone unnoticed. He'd heard the whispers. Seen the judgmental glances. Of course she lashed out. What do you expect? That family was always going to be trouble. He shouldn't have adopted them. Ethan's jaw tightened. He had lived in this town for years. Served it. Protected it. But the moment his girls were seen as a problem, the town's loyalty had evaporated like smoke. They don't get to decide who belongs in this family, Ethan muttered under his breath. Behind him, footsteps padded into the room. He turned to see Amaya standing near the staircase, her arms crossed over her chest. You sure about this? She asked. Yeah, Ethan said. We can't let them win. And how are we going to fight this? Amaya's gaze sharpened. The school board isn't going to listen to you. They've already made up their minds. Then we make them listen. Ethan's eyes flashed with determination. We force them to see the truth. Amaya's lips curled slightly. And how do we do that? We get the community involved. Amaya's eyebrows shot up. And how exactly are you going to convince a town full of judgmental bigots to take our side? Not everyone's against us, Ethan said. There are good people here, people who know what's right. We just have to give them a reason to stand with us. And if they don't? Ethan smiled grimly. Then we fight harder. Later that day, Ethan and Amaya stood in front of the school board office, their backs straight and their expressions hard. A small crowd had gathered, parents, teachers, and even a few students who had heard about Tiana's suspension. Tiana stood nearby, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her face was tense, guarded. Sierra stood beside her, quiet but focused. What if they don't listen? Sierra asked. They will, Ethan said. Because we're not backing down. Yeah. Tiana said. And what if they let us out of the room? Then we come back tomorrow, Ethan said simply. And the next day. And the next. Tiana's gaze softened. You're serious about this, she said. Damn right I am. Just then, a familiar figure appeared at the edge of the crowd. Mother Henrietta. Dressed in her usual crisp church attire, gray hair swept into a tight bun, she moved through the crowd with calm authority. Her sharp eyes met Ethan's. Well, she said. What's the plan? Ethan smiled faintly. Glad you could make it, Mother Henrietta. I've been waiting for you to fight back, Ethan, she said. Took you long enough. Better late than never. Mother Henrietta's eyes softened as she glanced at Tiana. You've got a strong girl there. I know. The crowd began to grow larger. More people arriving. Some familiar faces. Some strangers. Even a few of Ethan's fellow officers showed up, standing toward the back, arms crossed. Amaya stepped closer to Ethan. Okay. They're here. Now what? Now, Ethan said, we make them listen. Inside the school board office, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The board members sat behind a long table, their faces a mixture of boredom and thinly veiled disdain. Mrs. Carter sat at the center, her mouth drawn into a tight line. Ethan stood in front of them, flanked by Amaya and Mother Henrietta. Tiana sat in the audience, her arms crossed. Mr. Carter, Mrs. Carter began stiffly, you requested this meeting to challenge your daughter's suspension. We've already reviewed the case. The decision stands. Then you didn't review it hard enough, Ethan said, his voice calm but sharp. Mrs. Carter's eyes narrowed. Excuse me. You're punishing my daughter for defending herself, Ethan said. But the boy who insulted her? He gets a warning. Mrs. Carter's lips thinned. Mr. Carter. No, Ethan cut in. You listen to me. My daughter was called names. Racial slurs. And when she stood up for herself, you punished her. That's not justice. That's cowardice. A murmur rippled through the room. Mrs. Carter's gaze sharpened. We have a zero-tolerance policy for violence. Then enforce a zero-tolerance policy for racism, Ethan shot back. That's not how this works. Then change the system. Mrs. Carter's face darkened. Look around, Ethan said, gesturing to the crowd behind him. Do you see how many people showed up today? These are the people you represent. And they are watching you right now. They're watching to see if you have the courage to do what's right or if you're going to keep pretending this town doesn't have a problem. Mrs. Carter's jaw tightened. Tiana stood up for herself, Ethan said, his voice rising. She fought back because no one else did. And now you're punishing her for it? The board members exchanged nervous glances. This isn't just about my daughter, Ethan continued. This is about how this town treats people who don't look like everyone else. And you know what? We're done being quiet about it. Silence. Mrs. Carter's expression flickered the first crack in her carefully composed mask. Ethan's gaze darkened. So what's it going to be? Mrs. Carter inhaled sharply. We'll review the case. No, Ethan said coldly. You'll overturn the suspension. Today. Mrs. Carter's hands curled into fists. You're putting us in a difficult position, Mr. Carter. Good, Ethan said. A long silence stretched across the room. Finally, Mrs. Carter's gaze dropped. The suspension is overturned, she said reluctantly. A wave of relief swept through the room. Tiana's eyes widened. Thank you, Ethan said. Mrs. Carter stood. Don't me. I'm not, Ethan said. As they walked out of the office, Mother Henrietta smiled knowingly. That was impressive, she said. Ethan exhaled slowly. We're not done yet. No, Mother Henrietta agreed. But it's a start. Ethan glanced at Tiana, who was walking ahead of them, her head held higher than it had been in weeks. Yeah, Ethan said softly. It's a start. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Outside the window, the sun was beginning to set, streaking the sky with soft hues of orange and pink. His house was unusually quiet, the calm after the storm. It had been 2 days since the school board overturned Tiana's suspension. 2 days since Ethan had stood before that room of judgmental faces and forced them to face their own hypocrisy. 2 days since Tiana had smiled at him, really smiled for the first time in weeks. But Ethan knew that winning one battle wasn't the same as winning the war. One suspension overturned doesn't mean this town has changed. He rubbed the back of his neck, tension coiling in his shoulders. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Amaya appeared at the doorway, a folder in her hands. She leaned against the doorframe, her expression unreadable. Dad, she said. We need to talk. Ethan sighed and gestured toward the chair across from him. What's on your mind? Amaya sat down, sliding the folder across the table toward him. I've been thinking about what you said about how we have to make this town listen. About how we need to change the way things work. Ethan opened the folder. Inside were printed reports, newspaper articles, statistics, a carefully compiled record of racial discrimination cases from their town over the last decade. Suspensions, unfair punishments, racial bias in hiring, even reports of police profiling. You did all this? Ethan asked, his brow furrowing. Amaya nodded. It wasn't that hard to find once I started digging. This isn't just about Tiana. It's about how this town treats anyone who doesn't fit the mold. Ethan's eyes darkened as he flipped through the pages. This is bad. I know. What are you suggesting? Amaya leaned forward, her gaze sharp. We can't just fight each battle individually. That's what they expect us to do, react, get angry, let it fade. We need to go bigger. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Bigger. We start a foundation, Amaya said. A real one. A place where kids like Tiana and adults can go for support. Somewhere they can feel safe, where they can learn how to defend themselves, know their rights, and get legal protection when they need it. Ethan's eyes widened slightly. That's ambitious. It's necessary, Amaya said. If we want to change the way this town works, we have to give people the tools to fight back. Ethan sat back in his chair, considering. He glanced at the folder again, at the statistics, the cold hard evidence of what had been happening under the surface of their nice little town for years. He thought about Tiana. About how close she had come to giving up. It's going to take a lot of work, he said finally. I know, Amaya replied. But we have the connections. You know the police force, I know the schools, and Mother Henrietta has more influence in this town than anyone gives her credit for. Ethan's mouth quirked into a faint smile. That's true. I've already spoken to her, Amaya said. She's in. Ethan's eyes widened. Really? Really, Amaya said. She said, and I quote, about damn time. Ethan chuckled. That sounds like her. Amaya's gaze sharpened. But we need you too, Dad. People listen to you. They respect you even if some of them don't deserve you. Ethan's smile faded slightly. This could put a target on us, he said quietly. You understand that, right? Let them come, Amaya said, her eyes flashing with determination. We've already survived worse. Ethan sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He thought about Tiana's tearful eyes in the car that day. The way the school board had looked at her like she was a problem instead of a person. All right, he said finally. Let's do it. A week later. The community center was packed. Rows of folding chairs filled the main hall. On the walls were posters of black leaders and activists: Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Angela Davis. Ethan stood at the front of the room, adjusting the microphone as the crowd settled. Amaya stood beside him, calm and focused. Tiana, Sierra, and the other girls sat in the front row, their eyes shining with curiosity and quiet excitement. Good evening, Ethan began, his voice carrying through the hall. I want to thank all of you for being here tonight. He paused, letting his gaze sweep over the crowd. He saw familiar faces: Mother Henrietta, Officer Brown from the department, even Mrs. Thompson sitting stiffly toward the back. You all know why we're here, Ethan said. Our town has a problem. A problem that's been ignored for too long. A problem of racism, discrimination, and injustice. The room was dead silent. We've seen it in our schools, Ethan continued. We've seen it in our police force. We've seen it in our neighborhoods. And for too long, we've let it slide. Amaya stepped forward. That changes today. Ethan's gaze sharpened. We're starting the Carter Foundation. A ripple of whispers ran through the room. The goal of this foundation is simple, Ethan said. To protect the vulnerable. To provide support and education. To make sure that what happened to Tiana, what's been happening to kids in this town for years, never happens again. Amaya's eyes flashed. We'll provide legal aid, educational resources, and a place for kids to come when they need help. We'll teach them how to defend themselves, not with violence, but with knowledge. With strength. With unity. Ethan's gaze darkened. And if this town wants to keep pretending that nothing's wrong, if they want to keep turning their backs on the people they don't want to see, we're going to make sure they can't ignore us anymore. This is about power, Amaya said. About reclaiming it. It's about family, Ethan added, his voice deep with emotion. Because that's what this is. Family isn't about blood. It's about showing up for each other. It's about standing together when things get hard. It's about love. He glanced toward Tiana, whose eyes were shining with unshed tears. This town tried to break my daughter, Ethan said. It failed. And now we're going to make sure that no one else has to fight that battle alone. The room erupted into applause. Mother Henrietta stood first, clapping steadily. Then Officer Brown. Then Mrs. Thompson. Within seconds, the entire room was on its feet. Amaya's hand brushed Ethan's arm. We did it. We're just getting started, Ethan said, his voice low. Tiana rose from her seat and crossed the room toward Ethan. Without a word, she hugged him fierce and tight. Thank you, she whispered. For what? Ethan asked softly. For fighting for me. Ethan's hand settled on the back of her head. Always. Tiana pulled back, her eyes shining. What now? She asked. Ethan's gaze hardened. Now, he said. We get to work. Ethan adjusted his tie in the bathroom mirror, his reflection staring back at him with a hardened expression. The early morning sun cast thin lines of light across his face. His jaw was tight, the weight of the day already pressing down on him. Today wasn't just any day. Today was the first official meeting of the Carter Foundation. And the town was watching. A knock on the bathroom door made him turn. Dad. Amaya's voice. Come in, Ethan said, his voice low. Amaya pushed the door open and leaned against the frame, arms crossed over her chest. She wore a sharp black blazer over a white blouse, her hair pulled into a neat bun. Professional and confident, a woman who knew exactly what she wanted. You ready? She asked. Ethan exhaled through his nose. Not really. Amaya's lips twitched. Good. That means you're taking it seriously. Ethan chuckled despite himself. You're starting to sound like Mother Henrietta. Amaya's gaze softened. She's waiting for us downstairs, by the way. With Tiana and Sierra. Ethan adjusted his tie again, feeling Amaya's eyes on him. You sure about this? Ethan asked. We could still pull back, keep this quiet, let it settle. Amaya's gaze sharpened. No. Ethan met her eyes in the mirror. We've already made noise, Amaya said. Now we have to keep the momentum going. Ethan sighed. I just don't want this to backfire. It won't, Amaya said. Because we're not alone anymore. Ethan turned toward her. Dad, Amaya said, her voice steady. It's not just us anymore. People are showing up. They're listening. They're ready to fight too. We started something bigger than ourselves. Ethan studied her face for a long moment before nodding slowly. Let's go then. Later that morning, the community center was packed. Rows of chairs lined the room, filled with people from every corner of town. Black, white, Latino, Asian faces, young and old, all gathered together under one roof. Ethan stood at the front of the room, Amaya at his side. Tiana and Sierra sat in the front row, while Mother Henrietta sat a few seats behind them, her expression calm but watchful. The town's police chief, Marcus Walker, stood near the back with several officers. Ethan could feel the weight of their attention. He took a steadying breath and stepped up to the microphone. "Good morning," he said, his voice cutting through the low murmur of the crowd. The noise died down. "Thank you all for coming today," Ethan continued. "The fact that you're here tells me one thing: you care. About this town. About its future. About doing what's right." A few heads nodded. "We've all seen what's happening here," Ethan said. "We've seen how easy it is to look the other way when someone is treated unfairly. When kids are punished for defending themselves. When people are overlooked because of the color of their skin." Marcus Walker's eyes narrowed slightly, but he said nothing. "We can't ignore it anymore," Ethan said, his voice hardening. "We've started the Carter Foundation to make sure that no kid, no family feels like they have to stand alone." Amaya stepped up beside him. "We're providing legal support," she said. "Educational resources. Training. And most importantly, a community." Ethan's gaze sharpened. "But this isn't just about support," he said. "It's about accountability." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "We're going to make sure that schools, businesses, and even the police department know that discrimination has consequences," Ethan continued. "We will stand with anyone who needs us. We will fight for justice. And we won't stop until this town becomes the place it was always meant to be." A single clap echoed through the room. Mother Henrietta. She stood, her wrinkled hands pressed together as she nodded toward Ethan. Then more clapping. More people rising to their feet. Within seconds, the entire room was on its feet, the sound of applause thundering through the building. Ethan's chest tightened. For the first time in a long time, he felt hope. Amaya leaned toward him. "Told you." Ethan smiled faintly. "Let's see if they still feel this way when things get hard." 1 week later. "This isn't going to work." Tiana's voice was sharp as she paced across the dining room, her arms crossed. Amaya sat at the table, laptop open. Sierra was nearby, leaning against the wall. Ethan stood in the doorway, watching his daughters with narrowed eyes. "It's already working," Amaya said, not looking up from the screen. "2 students from the high school reached out today. And we've already scheduled a legal workshop for next week." "That's not what I mean," Tiana said, turning toward them. "You think people are just going to let us change things without a fight?" "They're going to push back," Ethan said. "We know that." "You don't get it," Tiana said, her voice rising. "I hear what people are saying at school. They're saying you're stirring up trouble. They're saying you're trying to change how this town works." "Good," Ethan said. Tiana's eyes flashed. "Good." "Yeah," Ethan said, his gaze hardening. "Because that means they're scared." Tiana's mouth opened, but no words came out. "This town needs to change," Ethan said. "And that means making people uncomfortable. And if they fight back?" Tiana demanded. "Then we fight harder," Amaya said. Tiana shook her head, her expression a mix of frustration and fear. It's not that simple. No, Ethan agreed. It's not. Tiana's hands curled into fists at her sides. You don't understand how this feels, she said quietly. To be the one people look at differently. To be the one who doesn't belong. Ethan's jaw tightened. You're right, he said. I don't. Tiana's eyes widened slightly. But I know what it feels like to see my daughter hurting and not know how to fix it, Ethan said, his voice low but fierce. I know what it feels like to want to protect you from a world that's too broken to understand you. Silence hung in the air between them. I can't change how people see you, Ethan said. But I can stand next to you while you face it. Tiana's face softened. We're not running away from this, Ethan said. Not anymore. Tiana's chest rose and fell rapidly as her anger and fear slowly drained away. Okay, she whispered. Ethan's gaze steadied. Okay. Tiana nodded. Okay. Amaya smiled faintly. We start with the school, Ethan said. Then the police department. Then the businesses. And if they push back? Tiana asked. Ethan's eyes darkened. Then we push harder. The next day, Ethan and Amaya stood in front of the school board again. Only this time, they weren't alone. Dozens of students and parents stood behind them. Tiana was there too, her arms crossed defiant. Ethan took a breath and faced the board members. Let's talk about accountability, he said. And this time, no one was leaving the room until they were heard. Ethan stood at the center of the school board meeting, the fluorescent lights overhead casting a harsh glow on the wooden paneled walls. The room was packed: students, parents, teachers, and tension hung so thick in the air that Ethan could feel it pressing against his chest. Amaya stood beside him, a folder tucked under her arm. Tiana sat in the front row, her arms crossed and her jaw set in a hard line. Sierra was next to her, clutching a pen so tightly her knuckles were white. At the front of the room sat the school board: 5 middle-aged men and 1 woman, each wearing the same detached, bureaucratic expression Ethan had come to hate. The chairman, Mr. Raymond Whitaker, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. Mr. Carter, Whitaker said, his tone clipped. I assume you have prepared remarks. Ethan stepped toward the microphone. His pulse thrummed in his ears, but his voice remained steady. Yes, I do. He unfolded a piece of paper, glanced at it once, then set it aside. He didn't need notes for this. We're here because the school has a problem, Ethan began, his eyes sweeping across the room. A problem that's been ignored for too long. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Last month, my daughter Tiana was suspended for defending herself after a student called her a racial slur, Ethan continued. The student who provoked the situation faced no consequences. My daughter was punished for standing up for herself. Whitaker sighed, adjusting his glasses. Mr. Carter, as we explained at the time. Save it, Amaya interrupted, her tone sharp. You're not going to talk your way out of this. Whitaker's eyes narrowed. Ms. Carter, this meeting is not the appropriate place for emotional outbursts. No, Ethan said, his voice rising. This is exactly the place for it. The crowd stirred. This isn't about one suspension, Ethan said. This is about a pattern of discrimination. Students of color are punished more harshly for the same infractions. They're disciplined more often. They're targeted. And it's not just students. Amaya handed him a folder. These are records, Ethan said, holding up the folder. 10 years of disciplinary reports. 10 years of racial disparity in how students are treated. 10 years of evidence that this school is failing its students of color. Whitaker's face darkened. I don't see how this. Of course you don't, Ethan cut in. Because you've never had to worry about whether your child would be singled out for the color of their skin. Whitaker's mouth opened, but Ethan wasn't finished. When Tiana was suspended, I asked myself how it happened, Ethan said. How a school board full of educated adults could let this happen. He let the silence hang for a moment before answering his own question. Because you're not listening, Ethan said, his voice sharp. You've built a system that works for you and people like you but leaves everyone else to fend for themselves. Whitaker's face flushed. You have no evidence that the school board. You want evidence. Amaya cut in, her eyes flashing. She opened the folder and handed copies of the disciplinary reports to the other board members. The data is all there, Amaya said. Same infractions, different punishments. Suspensions, expulsions. The pattern is undeniable. This is outrageous, one of the board members muttered. No, Ethan said. What's outrageous is that it took this long for someone to call you out on it. Whitaker stood, his expression dark. What exactly do you expect us to do, Mr. Carter? Start by changing the rules, Ethan said. You create the guidelines for punishment. You enforce them. That means you can change them. And if we refuse? Whitaker asked, his voice dripping with condescension. Amaya stepped forward. Then we'll take this public. Whitaker's jaw tightened. The Carter Foundation already has the attention of the State Board of Education, Amaya said. We've sent them copies of the reports. We've contacted the media. If you refuse to take action, we'll make sure the whole town knows what you're trying to hide. Whitaker's face paled. We're not asking, Ethan said, his voice cold. We're telling you what's going to happen. Whitaker's mouth twisted in anger, but Ethan could see the calculation in his eyes. Fine, Whitaker said, his voice sharp. We'll form a committee. Not good enough, Ethan said. We want permanent policy changes. Bias training for teachers and staff. A transparent disciplinary process with oversight from the community. That's excessive, another board member said. No, Amaya said, her eyes hard. That's justice. Whitaker's lips pressed into a thin line. You have 30 days to present a new plan to the community, Ethan said. If you don't, we'll take it to the state. Whitaker's hands curled into fists at his sides. You're setting a dangerous precedent, Mr. Carter. Ethan's gaze didn't waver. Good. Whitaker sat down, his face tight with anger. This meeting is adjourned. Ethan stepped back from the microphone as the room erupted into whispers. Amaya grinned. Not bad. We'll see if they follow through, Ethan muttered. As Ethan and Amaya left the room, Tiana caught his arm. Dad, she said, her eyes shining. You really think this will work? Ethan brushed his hand over her shoulder. I think we just cracked the system, he said. Now we see how hard it tries to put itself back together. 2 weeks later. The first step came faster than expected. The school board released a public statement admitting to inconsistencies in their disciplinary process and committing to a full review. They agreed to introduce bias training and appoint a community oversight committee with Amaya as one of the co-chairs. It was progress. But it wasn't over. You know they're going to resist us at every step, Amaya said, sitting across from Ethan at the dining room table. I know, Ethan replied. And you're ready for that? Ethan's gaze hardened. Let them try. 1 month later. Ethan sat at the back of the auditorium as the new disciplinary guidelines were announced. Students and parents filed out afterward, many of them thanking Amaya as they passed. Tiana sat next to Ethan, her arms crossed but her eyes shining. I still don't think this town will ever really change, Tiana said. Ethan smiled faintly. Maybe not all at once, he said. But we made them listen. That's a start. Tiana leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. Thanks for fighting for me, Dad, she whispered. Ethan kissed the top of her head. Always. Across the room, Amaya stood with Mother Henrietta and Marcus Walker, reviewing the committee's first report. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. What are you thinking? Tiana asked. Ethan's gaze darkened. We fixed the schools, he said. Now we go after the police. Tiana's head shot up. You really think they'll let us? Ethan's smile was dangerous. Let them try to stop us. Ethan stood at the edge of the parking lot, his hands resting on his hips as the late afternoon sun blazed overhead. Across from him, the town's police station loomed, a squat, gray concrete building with narrow windows and a battered American flag hanging over the entrance. The Carter Foundation had already forced the school board to change its policies. Now, it was time for the harder fight. The police department. This wasn't going to be like the school board meeting. The police force didn't answer to public pressure the same way. They had power, real power, and Ethan knew exactly how dangerous that made them. You ready? Amaya's voice cut through the heat, steady and sharp. She stood at his side, a stack of folders tucked under one arm, her hair pulled back into a low braid. She was wearing a crisp white blouse and a navy skirt, businesslike, professional, but her eyes were cold steel. Not really, Ethan admitted. Amaya smiled faintly. Good. That means you're thinking clearly. The doors to the station opened. Chief Marcus Walker stepped out, his face as hard as the pavement beneath their feet. His uniform was crisp, his badge polished. He stopped in front of them, arms crossed over his broad chest. I assume this isn't a social call, Walker said, his tone dry. No, Ethan said. We need to talk. Walker's gaze darkened. Follow me. Inside the station. The station smelled like old coffee and stale air conditioning. Officers moved briskly through the halls, most of them shooting quick, guarded glances at Ethan and Amaya as they passed. Walker led them to a small conference room. The walls were bare except for a row of faded photos of former police chiefs. Walker sat at the head of the table. Ethan and Amaya sat opposite him. All right, Walker said, his eyes narrowing. Let's hear it. Ethan leaned forward. We've received over 24 complaints of racial profiling from the department over the past year. Walker's brow lifted slightly. We've also collected reports from Black and Latino drivers pulled over without cause. Searches conducted without warrants. Excessive force during routine stops, Amaya added. Not to mention the 5 incidents involving students from the high school, Ethan said. After the disciplinary changes, kids are still telling us they feel targeted. Walker's ing didn't change. I see, he said. And you've compiled evidence. Amaya set the folder down on the table. It's all here. Dates, names, badge numbers. Walker opened the folder. His eyes skimmed the pages. Slowly, his jaw tightened. I'm going to assume this was obtained, legally. Public records, Amaya said coolly. And first-hand testimony. Walker's eyes lifted to Ethan. And you want me to, what, exactly? Fix it, Ethan said. We want the department to revise its use of force policies. We want body cam footage released in any case of disputed arrest. We want independent oversight for complaints against officers. Walker's mouth twisted. That's ambitious, he said. And unrealistic. We got the school board to change, Ethan said. We can do the same here. The school board doesn't carry weapons, Walker replied. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Are you threatening us? Walker smiled faintly. Of course not. Just pointing out the difference between political pressure and reality. Amaya's gaze sharpened. Chief Walker, if you refuse to cooperate, we'll escalate this. Walker's smile faded. To whom? State investigators, Ethan said. Federal authorities. Walker leaned back in his chair, his arms still crossed. You'd be opening a wound this town might not recover from, Walker said. The press would get involved. The town's reputation would suffer. Funding would be cut. Or, Amaya said, you could fix the problem before it gets that far. Walker's eyes locked on hers. You're playing a dangerous game, he said. We're not playing, Ethan replied. The silence stretched between them. Walker stood. Give me a week, Walker said. I'll review the files. We'll expect a response, Ethan said. You'll get one, Walker replied. His eyes darkened. Whether you like it or not. 3 days later. Ethan was sitting on the back porch when Amaya's phone buzzed. It's Walker, she said, holding up the screen. Ethan straightened. Put it on speaker. Amaya tapped the screen. Mr. Carter, Walker's voice crackled over the line. I've reviewed the files. There are inconsistencies. Inconsistencies. Ethan repeated. Enough that I'm willing to recommend some policy adjustments, Walker said. Ethan's eyes narrowed. But, Walker continued, I have conditions. Of course you do, Amaya said. We'll review the complaints internally, Walker said. But body cam footage remains off the table. We can't risk compromising ongoing investigations. Not good enough, Ethan said. It's a compromise, Walker replied. No, Amaya said. It's a way to hide accountability. Walker's voice hardened. I'm giving you a path to progress. Take it or leave it. Ethan stood and took the phone from Amaya. We'll think about it, he said. But you should know something, Chief Walker. What's that? We're not going away, Ethan said. If you don't follow through, we'll take this higher. Do what you need to do, Walker said. The call ended. Amaya sighed. He's not going to change unless we make him. I know, Ethan said. So what's the next step? Amaya asked. Ethan's jaw tightened. We make them uncomfortable. 2 weeks later. A protest. A real one. Organized by Amaya and Tiana, the protest stretched down Main Street. Hundreds of people carried signs. Justice for all. End racial profiling. Protect our kids. Ethan stood at the front with Amaya, Tiana, and Sierra. His daughter's eyes were burning with determination. Police officers lined the sidewalks. Some watched silently. Others whispered into radios. Walker stood at the edge of the line, his expression blank. Tiana stepped toward him. How does it feel? she asked, her voice sharp. Being the one under the microscope. Walker's jaw flexed. This isn't going away, Ethan said, stepping beside Tiana. We're going to keep showing up. Every day. Every time something happens. You think you can outlast us? Walker asked. Ethan smiled coldly. We're not going anywhere. 3 days later.